As we continue our little journey on the Fortune High School yearbooks of yesterday, I mainly wanted to focus on the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, when you go through 100 yearbooks, there's lots of stuff I could show you and tell you and give you information, but that's like 30 videos. So I just want to highlight a few things. Perhaps some of the things, well, maybe you didn't know. For example, the student yearbook. If you were to look at the student yearbooks from the 1900s, you would think that they just didn't know how to spell, because these yearbooks appear to be spelled STVDENT. Now, I'm sure that's a U, but because of the type of font they use, it certainly looks like a V. And they used that on and off until about 1917. And it could have been that this font was very popular back then, and they didn't think anything of it. One of the things that students take for granted is dancing. In the school, usually they trim the gym up and looks pretty nice. They have a homecoming dance there, or they'll have a special dance there. But this wasn't always the case. You say, well, wait a minute, they always had dancing even back in the 1800s. Well, yes, that's true, but they didn't have dancing inside the school itself. And this caused some problems along the way. Students were upset they couldn't dance, so they had to go outside the school to dance. Most of the parties and the dances took place on this corner here, the corner of Pine and Military Street. This is what it looks like today, but this used to be the Elks Temple. But the students wanted to have their parties and their dances inside the school itself. In this editorial from 1909, it gives us a look at their mindset. It says this: last year, the junior class asked the Board of Education for permission to give parties in the high school auditorium. The board refused the request on the grounds that many citizens were opposed to the giving of parties in the high school because they objected to dancing itself, or believed the auditorium should be used for educational purposes solely, and did not believe dancing educational. I'm not going to read all this, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. The high school students have given parties for many years, and no attempt has been made to stop them. While if the people objected to dancing, they would have stopped them long ago. The Methodists, who have in the past been the strongest opponents of dancing, at their last conference amended their laws to permit dancing. The United States government believes that dancing is educational. It requires, and has required since the establishment of the schools, that students at West Point and Annapolis learn to dance, and it encourages them to attend the weekly dances held in the gymnasiums of the school. And then they go on to defend their position by saying all these other schools are doing it, why not us? And it ends with this: one thing is certain, that the students will continue to give parties. Our question is, why not let them give their parties in the high school building, and help them to make their parties the desirable, beneficial kind? I don't know. I think maybe the Methodists had the right idea. They were afraid of the partners maybe getting too close, and back then, of course, compared to today's standards, it wasn't close at all. And not only getting close, but they would probably have a heart attack, the chaperones back then, if they were to see these dances today and what transpires. But then, maybe again, maybe I'm no fuddy-duddy. Something else they would have been a little confused about back in the 1800s would have been driver's education. I mean, can you imagine getting into one of those dangerous contraptions when you got a perfectly good horse? But here you see one of the driving instructors with a young lady teaching them how to drive. And then when they finally got enough nerve to get in that contraption, well, here they are now. You've got the driving instructor on the right and the student there on the left. And this was in front of the foyer in high school. Now, if you believe those first two photos I just showed you, then I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. Actually, driver's education didn't appear in the student yearbook until 1948, which is this photograph right here. This was in the 1948 yearbook. There's a few of these pictures I want to show you that transpired through the years. I'm sure the students were just as nervous driving, the only difference being the cars were different, later models. This last photograph here was taken in 1968, and after that I didn't really see anything in the student yearbook about driver's education, so it may have been discontinued at that time. Today we take our class pictures being in the yearbook as a given, but that hasn't always been the case. Back between 1900 and 1910, they didn't have class pictures per se. Underclassmen were never mentioned by name, and if you were a senior, you had your name usually listed in the roster, or it wasn't mentioned at all. But somehow, the staff of the student yearbook always got their pictures in it, along with, who else? The principal. And there was the occasional athletic picture in the yearbook as well, and we'll cover athletics at a later time. It wasn't until 1910 that you saw the seniors have their pictures in the yearbook. And in this yearbook, there was a little saying by each one of the seniors' pictures. And you can read them as we scroll down here. It wasn't until about 1927 that you started to see underclassmen's pictures in the yearbook. In the early yearbooks, the faculty didn't have pictures, they just were listed by name. But the funny thing about it, the new teachers, they had their pictures in the yearbook. And here's one of them now, and here's another. And when they did put a picture of the faculty in the yearbook, it was always a group picture, just like this one here. But eventually there was individual pictures taken of the faculty, as you can see in this yearbook from 1925. And since we're discussing faculty, here's a fellow you might remember if you're around my age or even much older than my age, because he was the principal of Port Huron High School for a long time. Mr. Tomlinson. Mr. Tomlinson started as principal of Port Huron High in the early 1940s. Of course, he didn't look like this then. He looked more like this. And he continued until 1960 when he said goodbye to the Port Huron High School. And the yearbook celebrated this with these photographs that you see here. Someone else you might remember is this lady right here, Miss Wise. She was originally a counselor and later went on to become the assistant principal of the high school. And in 1965, the yearbook honored her at her retirement. The yearbooks of the very early 1900s may not have the class names or pictures, may not even have the faculty names or pictures. They focused on the literary. And let's just read a little bit of this comment they made in this yearbook. In considering an education, we are apt to omit one very essential point, the study of art. A person is considered uneducated who has no knowledge of the works of Shakespeare, Longfellow, Whittier, and Scott, and yet how many are familiar with the masterpieces of the great artists as Raphael, Murillo, Van Dyck, and Corot? The influence of good pictures should start in childhood, and the interest in them grow beyond the school life, leading to more extended study in later years. The presence of pictures in the classroom is receiving more and more attention in the public schools. And it goes on, and I'll let you read this at your leisure. They're also big in encouraging the students to write poetry, as you can see by this little side poem here on the right-hand side. They would also have contests to see who could write the best love story for the yearbook. And here are just a couple that I pulled out for you. Two Hearts and Another, and the other story is called Moonlight. Along with the literary and arts and love stories and poems, they also put their grievances in the yearbook as well. And here's one of them. We have noticed considerable in the papers of late concerning the proposed addition to the high school, and we hope every student and every citizen who has one spark of loyalty will demand a new building instead. It seems a pity to the fair-minded person that the city fathers will spend $100,000 on such hazy objects as the canal, but would hold up their hands in horror if a similar amount was asked for a new building. We suppose they consider it more important to the city as a whole that Black River, which has been proved harmless, should be properly drained than that proper facilities should be given for public education. One favorite argument of the canal workers is that the dirty conditions of Black River puts the city in a bad light before visitors. We might say that these people are only transients and wonder if a person was intending to live in Port Huron, they would not look into the school system for their children's sake more than into the canal scheme. Some people are very dense. Well, I guess they told them. I'm not too sure they were correct in the Black River. Black River was a very smelly river. It would take the paint right off the buildings that were close to it. So I think it was much needed, but I can understand their viewpoint as well. They did all these things to put something in the yearbook because back then they didn't really have that many photographs. You couldn't just scan a photograph into a yearbook. They had something called halftones, and it had to be done by a professional photographer. This added extra expense to the yearbooks as well. For every photograph in, that raised the price of the yearbook cost. In the 1909 yearbook, they had several pictures in it. Here's one in one of the classrooms at the new school at that time, which is now the college. And in 1909, they made the bold move of putting a photograph on the cover of the yearbook. In those days, you couldn't just scan a photo. You had to take it to a professional photographer because they used halftones, which is just a series of dots to make it look like a photograph. Most of the photographs for the yearbook was taken by this studio, Biddlecombe Studio. But lo and behold, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, an invention came into being that would change, well, our social lives forever, including the yearbooks. That change was the camera. Well, there was cameras before that, but for cameras for the general public. These first three cameras that you're looking at, Eastman Kodaks, were the only three on this page that actually took film. The other ones took plates. The lowest priced one, number 2 Bullseye Special Kodak, was $15. These cameras are marketed to the general public. However, you had to be very wealthy to be able to afford one of these cameras. $15 back then was equivalent to $450 today, and there's no student or teacher that could afford that. That all changed when Eastman Kodak produced this camera, the Brownie. Now, most of us of a certain age have all had a Brownie camera at one time or another. It was the thing to have. And this camera was affordable to the general public. This camera only costed $1, which is equivalent to about $19 today, so it was affordable. And Eastman Kodak marketed this to school kids. Look what it says here, operated by any schoolboy or girl. And it came with a 44-page booklet giving full directions for operating the camera. And this is the camera where the term snapshot came into being. Later on, they even came out with a Boy Scout brownie camera. They certainly wanted the young people, and young people they got. They were making it so easy that even kids could take pictures. The local businessmen also jumped on the bandwagon. And this ad that was in the student yearbook from Patterson and McTaggart, you can see that they were pushing these cameras for the students. Patterson and McTaggart was located on Military Street on the west side, the 900 block, and you can see that tall building there with the signage on the side of it, and that gives the name. But also, if you look at the very bottom, you can't make out the whole word, but that word is Kodaks. So they had their advertisement for the cameras right on the side of the building. Another yearbook ad shows an ad for Sylvester's, which was a drugstore, and shows that they had their own darkroom and were set up for the Kodak cameras and supplies. Both McTaggart Patterson and Sylvester's had their own darkroom, and neither was a camera store, because basically they didn't have camera stores in those days. Sylvester's was located on the corner of Quay and Huron Avenue, be the northwest corner, what it looks like today, and this is what it looked like back then. And if you look closely, you can see the logo for Sylvester's over their front door. With a camera that cost $1 and film that cost 15 cents, soon many families in Port Huron had a brownie camera. And those families had students that went to Port Huron High School. And pretty soon, snapshots were in the yearbooks. So let's take a look at some of these snapshots over the years. In this first photo, it shows some of the automobiles parked on the other side of River Street, and then in this picture right next to it, look at the number of bicycles that were there for the Port Huron High students. And notice at that time, the roads were still brick. The current yearbooks, snapshots, they look a little different. I don't even call them snapshots anymore. But it all started with a camera called the Brownie. Join me in our next video and we'll see if we can finish this segment on the Port Huron High School yearbooks.